Okay, what we're going to be doing today is, this evening, is talking about a woman in the Bible that doesn't get mentioned very much. We are going to be talking about Zipporah, but we're also going to be talking about intermarriage, circumcision, and sex. So, okay, that's called a lead, okay? All right. All right. What I thought, the pages of the handout that I gave you are numbered in the right-hand corner with a circle around the number of the page. So if you will, take a look at page number 1. And just read the section that you have there, verses 16 through 21. Take a moment to read that. Page 1, right? There's 1 in the corner. And you have on page 1, yes, it's page 325 in Eitz Chaim, from which this was Xeroxed. Okay? You don't have them? You have them all? Okay. All right, we're on page 1 of the handout. Here's the handout. Okay, sure. And so if you will, just take a moment and read the verses that are there from, you need 2 of them, from Exodus chapter 2. Sure. Okay, does anybody remember what this is coming after? Moses is in Midian. Why is he in Midian? He escaped. Why did he escape? He had killed an Egyptian. That's exactly right. And so he escapes from Midian lest he be killed himself. He escapes from Egypt, lest he be killed himself. Okay, so he comes to Midian, and where does he go first? To the well, of course, because that is the watering hole, right? That's where you meet people. Where else have you heard about people going to the well to meet people? Mecca. Well, certainly in Mecca, that's right, but in the Torah. Pardon me? Yes, that's right. Jacob with Rachel, remember? And Jacob, not only feeds his own camels, he feeds her camels and then gives her water to drink besides. So that's where Jacob meets Rachel. Where else did you hear about somebody meeting somebody at the well? Yes. Who meets Rebecca? Eliezer. That's right. Abraham's servant is looking for a wife for Isaac, and he meets her at the well, right? Because that was the communal place where you met people. And in each of these cases, the thing that marks the person as the right person is that there's an act of kindness that's done, either by the man or the woman involved, and that marks the person as the right one. In this case, what happens is they come to draw water and fill the women, the 7 daughters of the priest of Midian. What's his name? Reuel. In other places in the Torah, what's his name? Yitro, that's right. This is, now there's some confusion, frankly, in the Torah as to whether Moses' father-in-law was named Yitro or Jethro or Reuel. And in one place, you'll see it later, he's mentioned, his name is Chovav. So there are 3 different names that are used for Moses' father-in-law. But here it's Reuel, and he has 7 daughters. And they go to fill the troughs from the well. That is, for those of us that are city slickers, good, thank you. Great, good. Oh, wow, hello there. Okay, for those of us that are city slickers, let me just tell you that in ancient times and still in modern times, you have to draw up water from the well. Okay, you don't just turn on a spigot. You draw up water from the well, and you then fill the troughs for the animals. Okay. As a matter of fact, some of you may know that we had a rabbinical student here for a number of years, Gershon Susamu from Uganda. And when he and his wife and 2 children at the time, they came, I think, on a Tuesday, and my wife and I hosted them for the first Shabbat that they were here. And I asked him 4 or 5 days after they had gotten here, what is the most unusual thing that you have seen in America in your first 4 or 5 days? And without blinking, without even thinking, he said, the shower. Okay? So I said, why that? So he said, well, first of all, in Uganda, water is scarce, so you have to decide whether you're going to use the water to bathe in the first place. And if you are going to do that, you remember Governor Schwarzenegger wanted us to take a maximum of 5-minute showers? Forget about 5-minute showers. You go and you get water from the well, you take it back to your house, and you take a sponge bath, effectively, right? And you don't do that very often either. And here they come to America, and lo and behold, you turn it on, and there it is, okay? Now, the thing is, they put the water in the troughs in order to feed their animals, and then what happens? Shepherds come, presumably men, and do what? They try to hit on them, and they use the water that these women have just drawn from the well and put into the troughs for their own animals. And what does Moses do? He gets rid of them, right? He rises to their defense, and he waters their flock. And then what happens? They go home, and what does their father say? How come you're home so fast? Okay, because he knows that usually it takes more time. And he says, well, there was this Egyptian that helped us. And so he says, well, bring him in. Moses consented to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah, presumably not immediately, as his wife. Okay? So this is the first time that we meet Zipporah. She's one of the 7. We don't know whether she's the oldest of the 7. Usually in the ancient world, you remember the Leah and Rachel story. Usually in the ancient world, the oldest had to be married off first, and then the second oldest, and so on down the line. So it's at least possible that Zipporah was the oldest of the 7. But we don't know that from here. And she bore the 2 of them a son, Gershom, which the Torah says was the name because I have been a stranger in a foreign land. Ki amar ger hayiti be'eretz nochriya. Okay, so the word ger is there. Gershom, I was a stranger there. Okay, presumably this is a name that Moses gave because this was not a strange land for Zipporah. This was her own land for Zipporah. Now, the first thing, of course, that one immediately sees here is that he is marrying somebody who is he's not Jewish. She's not Jewish, right? She's a Midianite. And she's not of the Hebrews. So, I mean, there was a very clear people with whom he had already identified, right? In Egypt already, he understands that he's part of the Hebrews. The word Hebrew comes from the Hebrew word meaning to pass from one place to another. And the first name that we have in the Bible, that the Jews have in the Bible, is Hebrews, which means that we are descended from people who pass from one place to another. Why do they go from one place to another? They were shepherds, and they were nomads as a result. And as shepherds, you need to find new grass for your animals, and so you move from one place to another. So the first name that we're called in the Bible is Ivrim, Hebrews. By the time we get to Egypt, we are a subset of Hebrews. We are Israelites, right? Who was Israel? Jacob, that's right. And when does he get the name Israel? Yes, when he wrestles with the angel. Okay, and then the angel calls him Yisrael. He wrestled with God. Okay, so we are a subset of the Hebrews. We are Israelites. When do we get the name Jew, by the way? Judea, that's right. Later on, the Israelites leave Egypt, right? And they ultimately occupy the land of Canaan. And then the northern kingdom, consisting of 10 tribes, gets destroyed by the Assyrians in 722. That leaves the southern kingdom called Judah, because there were 2 tribes there, Judah and Benjamin, Judah being the larger of the 2. Then that Judea is first ruled by the Assyrians, but then the Assyrians are conquered by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians destroy the first temple in 586 and take the Jews, that is, the descendants of Judea, back to Babylonia in chains. So the Israelites are a subset of the Hebrews, and the Jews are a subset of the Israelites. So far, so good? Okay. So he knows that he is a member, he's a Hebrew, and even an Israelite. How does he know that he is that? His mother nursed him, right? You remember that story, right? He was, remember there was a Pharaoh had decreed that all the male children should be slaughtered, but he was rescued by his sister, Miriam, and then ultimately raised in the Egyptian palace by one of the daughters of Pharaoh. You remember this, right? Okay. So how does he? So if he was raised as an Egyptian, how does he know that he's a Hebrew? I'm sorry? I just didn't hear you.
He's circumcised.
Well, no, we don't know that. Okay. Yes, that's right. He was nursed, but how does he know as an adult that he's a Hebrew?
By his blanket?
Yes. Well, his blanket. No, he goes out. Remember, he leaves the palace, yes?
Isn't this when he's out of the palace and he either slaps or kills someone, and that's when he's discovered, or
Yes.
someone says to him,
Yes, that's right.
You're a Jew, and
You're a Hebrew, and you have slapped somebody who is that way. Right. That's when he finds out that he's a Hebrew. When somebody else identifies him as such. Why that person knew that Moses was a Hebrew is not clear. Okay, but in any case, he's had this event happen in his life, so he knows he's a Hebrew, and now he's marrying a Midianite, right? So, and later in the Torah, we're going to get a law against marrying outside the family, and not only later, you remember that in the stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs, right? Sarah and Abraham marry within the clan, and then Eliezer is sent back to the clan, right, to the extended clan, Lot the uncle, right, to marry somebody from the extended clan, right? So Rebecca comes from the extended clan, and who's the other son of Sarah and Abraham? Ishmael. And what happens with Ishmael? He marries outside the faith. And this is a piece of Genesis that you may have sort of just jumped over. Sarah and Abraham are not happy about that, so he marries someone else within the clan. And the same thing happens with the next generation, right? You have Jacob and Esau. Jacob marries within the clan. Esau does not. And Jacob and Rachel are not happy about that, so he takes another wife within the clan. So clearly, what's called endogamy, that is marrying within the group, is something that was a norm within this Hebrew group long before we got to Moses. This was something that was expected. And yet, Moses here is marrying outside the clan, and he's marrying a Midianite. So the rabbis have to deal with this. What would you guess is the justification that they give for Moses, no less, marrying outside the clan? Yes?
He wasn't raised as a Jew, so he probably doesn't identify with being a Jew and with the rules about being Jewish.
Okay.
Even though he knows that that's his heritage, just like when people have been raised in other faiths and find out that their, great-grandparents were Jewish,
right.
They're not connected to that.
Good. So one way that you might justify it is that he barely knew that he was Jewish, let alone, and he certainly didn't know what the content of that identity was. And he certainly didn't know that endogamy was part of what it meant to be Jewish. So one way of justifying his doing it is that later the rabbis will call this kind of person a tinok shenishba bagoyim, a baby that was taken captive among the nations. Right? A Jewish baby that was taken captive among the nations cannot be expected to know anything about his or her Jewish identity, let alone this particular piece of it. And by the way, there were a lot of such people during the Holocaust that were saved by righteous Gentiles. And later on, some of those people were were told that they were Jewish and then sought out their Jewish identity. Some of those people remained usually Catholic, and one of those people ultimately became Cardinal of Paris, right? I've been in Poland twice to teach Catholic seminarians and seminary professors, and in both times that I was there, I met people who were Catholic priests who had discovered that they had Jewish parentage. And John Paul II actually talked to one of them and said, by all means go and find your Jewish roots, right? So I mean, this kind of thing, Moses being in a foreign land, not really knowing very much about his Jewish identity, was not something only for antiquity. It's something that has happened within the last 100 years as well. And as you say, there are a lot of people who are discovering Hispanics, that are discovering that they were descendants of what are sometimes called Marranos, right? In other words, people who, the people who were forced to convert, at least outwardly, but then turned out that, but they tried to keep their Jewish identity inwardly. And you have a lot of those people in New Mexico and in northern Mexico. And I actually was on the Beit Din for converting one such young man who sort of had a sense that he was Jewish from the time that he was 12. Now he was in college, and he was converting to Judaism formally. And frankly, I wish that every Jew knew as much about Judaism as he did. And we were going to talk about circumcision in a little while. He was not circumcised as a youngster, so as an adult, ouch is right. And in any case, but he did it. And so it might be that one way to justify this is, look, Moses was a babe that was taken by the nations, in this case Egypt. So how could he possibly know that he was not supposed to marry outside the faith? That's one possibility. What's another possibility? Go ahead. Political reasons. Spell out what you mean.
Well, be friendly with the Midians, and then you're not going to have to fight with them and have the arguments over land.
Okay, this was good. This.
One more question. Can you turn off the thermostat? The people of the desert are a little colder. I know I am.
Well, if somebody knows how to do that, I'm 11 thumbs. So if somebody knows how to, I think it's there, isn't it? Either way. If somebody, all right, I really don't want to play with it. Okay, so one possibility is that this was a political match, and he didn't want to fight with the Midians, and so he was willing to marry in. And of course, later in history, you get a lot of these kinds of political matches. Interestingly, the rabbis don't go in either one of these directions. I'm going to read to you from what the Midrash says. The Midrash is the rabbinic commentary on this. One Midrash says, Moses married Zipporah before the revelation of the Torah. And therefore, the rule wasn't yet a legal rule. Isn't that clever? Okay, right. The only problem with that is these precedents among the patriarchs and matriarchs, right? So clearly there was a common law, what the lawyers call a common law rule about endogamy long before the revelation at Sinai. But nevertheless, one way that the Midrash handles it is that it was a custom among the people of Israel. It wasn't yet a law, and therefore he was not responsible. The other way in which the Midrash deals with it is that she converted to Judaism. Now, of course, that isn't in the text, okay, right? It's not in the Torah at all, right? But one of the ways in which they're handling the fact that this is an intermarriage is to say that it wasn't really an intermarriage because she had converted before they actually got married. Now, how she did that in Midian, I have no idea. Okay, right? But it's an interesting way. You can see what the rabbis are grappling with, right? They're grappling with a norm that has been around since Abraham and Sarah, and which Moses has violated, and how could that possibly be? And so they're then looking for ways of justifying what Moses did. There was a hand up a minute ago. Yes.
Apparently, she didn't know that he was Hebrew. That's why she circumcised her son before they went back.
We're going to get to that right now. Okay. Now, one of the things that the Midrash points out here is that he gets identified by the daughters as an Egyptian, and we never hear that he says to Yitro or to the daughters that he's actually a Hebrew. So one of the things that the rabbis pick up on in this story is that it's at least possible that he never divulged the fact that he was a Hebrew to Zipporah and her family. And this was simply an Egyptian marrying a Midianite. And one of the Midrashim actually goes so far as to say that the reason why he was never allowed into the land of Israel, remember that, right? He dies before he's allowed in, had nothing to do with hitting the rock rather than speaking to the rock. The real reason why he was not allowed into the land of Israel is because he did not identify himself from the very beginning as a Jew. He allowed others to presume that he was an Egyptian. Well, I mean, you can take that or leave it as you will.
So let me ask you, so what happened with Ruth?
What happened with Ruth is a whole other story, okay? And first of all, at least it's clear that the Ruth story happens later, right? And so what happens in terms of converting to Judaism is, by the way, a very long story. What happens, with the people who ultimately leave Egypt with Moses is that you have, the Israelites and the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude, as it's usually translated. And then, of course, the question is, well, how did they become what we would call Jewish? And it clearly was some kind of way of marrying into the clan. You do get the story, if you remember, about Dinah. Do you remember the story about Dinah? Where she falls in love with a non-Jewish man, and the tribe of that man, the head of the tribe says, we want to become one clan with you. Our sons will marry your daughters, your daughters will marry our sons. And they say yes, only on condition that you are circumcised. And then what happens in that story? Do you remember? Yeah, then Reuven and Shimon kill them all after they've been circumcised. And Jacob is very distraught because now he's got a real political problem on his hands, let alone a military problem on his hands. Which leads us then, but notice that this is a story where the issue of, at least in the Torah, the issue of Moses marrying a Midianite woman is not, and then having a child by her, actually later a second child as well, that's not raised here in the same sort of a way that issue is raised with regard to both Ishmael and Esau in previous chapters of the Torah. There was a hand up a minute ago?
Yeah,
Yes.
that's mine. I keep making a whole story in my head, which was Yitro really adopted him into his family and cared much about him, and wanted his daughter and wanted him to be part of the family.
Right.
So maybe it came from the other side, and Moses probably figured he couldn't go back to Egypt anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, it's quite possible. That's right. I mean, this is chapter 2 of the book of Exodus. What happens in chapter 3 while he's in Midian? God comes to him in the burning bush. So you're absolutely right. In chapter 2, it's quite possible that he thought he was going to be there for the rest of his life. And so therefore he married, and he presumed that he was just going to settle there. Okay? But what in fact happens in chapter 3 is that, is that he has the burning bush theophany, and then, so therefore he's going to have to go back to Egypt. Okay? And what happens? Take a look now in chapter 4, page 2 of the handbook. Just flip it over. And if you will, read to yourself verses 24 and 20 through 26. It's on pages 2 and 3. It's a very difficult story. Please, by all means. Anybody else not have the packet? Help yourselves. Are there some more back there than you?
Oh,
You're reading the pages 2 and 3 in the Torah. Sure.
I knew the story, so I wanted to figure it out. I'm glad you did.
Now, this is a story that you didn't read in Hebrew school, all right? Okay, I mean, it got left out of the summary versions, and it's probably not a story that you've heard any rabbi talk about, okay? In part because it's difficult to understand, first of all, what happened in the story, and it's also difficult to understand why it happened once you figure out what happened. But let's take it piece by piece. They're on their way back to Egypt, right? Presumably together, Moses and Zipporah and their son. At a night encampment on the way, the Lord encountered him and sought to kill him. Now, who's the him? It could be the son. It could be Moshe. Okay, it's not clear here. There's no clear antecedent. But why do you think the son?
Because of the plagues about killing the firstborn.
That's going to come later. But yes, that's right. There is this notion of killing the firstborn son, where the presumption was that, that in the ancient world, by the way, this was very common, that the firstborn son was either dedicated to the gods or was sacrificed. We read in the Torah that in Moab, the firstborn son was sacrificed to Molech, the god there, right? What happens later on in the Torah itself with firstborn sons? What happens to them?
They're dedicated.
They are supposed to be dedicated to the temple. That's right. Okay? And in place of dedicating to the temple, they can be redeemed. This is a ceremony that we still do today called Pidyon Haben. That's right. A firstborn son. When the firstborn son is and by the way, of any firstborn son who is the son of an Israelite, if you happen to be the son of a Kohen or a Levi, then Pidyon Haben doesn't happen. And even if you are a grandson, I happen to be on my mother's side. My grandfather was a Levi, so there was no Pidyon Haben for me, even though, right, because my grandfather was a Levi, even though I'm not, because that was on my mother's side. Okay, but in any case, that's what the presumption was: firstborn sons belong to the gods in some form or another. So it might be that, okay, and that would make a lot of sense. We don't know whether Moses was circumcised or not. We never hear about that, okay. And as a matter of fact, later on in Joshua, what do we hear about in that first generation of Jews who leave Egypt? What happens during the time of Joshua? Do you know? This is chapter 5 of Joshua, in which they circumcised every male among the Israelites that left Egypt. So that would seem to indicate that the Israelites, while in Egypt, or at least many of them, were not circumcised. Now, why they were not circumcised could be anybody's guess. It might be because of the persecutions that the Jews were undergoing under that Pharaoh. It might be for other reasons. It may be very much like the reason why a lot of Russian Jews under the communists were not circumcised. And then when they came to this country, or Israel, you had a lot of adult circumcisions among Russian Jews, because you were taking your life in your hands if you were circumcised in communist Russia. That might have been the case in Egypt as well. So we don't know really about Moses, but this is what happens. God comes and says God wants to kill him. So Zipporah, not Moses, interestingly, Zipporah takes a flint, and if you take a look at the note in the let's see, where do you find that? And on page 3. Look at that note for just a moment. Page 3, do you see in the commentary, a flint rather than a metal knife, even though the events occurred in the late Bronze Age. A stone knife is still widely preferred in primitive societies that practice circumcision because flint can be given a sharper edge than metal, and the knife must be very sharp. So, by flint, I mean a stone kind of cutting edge. Okay? So Zipporah takes a flint and cuts off her son's foreskin and touched his legs with it. Why touched? Whose legs, by the way? Not clear. It could be the son's or Moshe's legs, saying, "You are truly a bridegroom of."
Disturbing the phone call that's very important back there.
Okay. Yeah, please turn off your cell phones and the like. Okay. You are truly a bridegroom of blood to me. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Not clear. Take a look at what the note says. These are the notes in Eitz Chaim, the Torah commentary for the conservative movement. This could refer either to Moses or to his son. We don't know what she was talking about. Is it the traditional English rendering of the unique? Of the unique Hebrew phrase "katan damim," for which no parallel has been found in ancient Near Eastern literature. In Arabic, the stem "katan" denotes to circumcise as well as to protect. Hence, the phrase could convey, "You are now circumcised and so protected for me by means of the blood of circumcision." That's at least a guess. Okay, but it's not at all clear, first of all, where she threw the foreskin and what she means by this. But what is true is that when he let him, and then when he let him alone, she added a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. So presumably, the circumcision now has warded off this threat to the son's life or to Moses' life, one or the other. What happens, by the way, in traditional Jewish law? Who is responsible for circumcising young infants? The father. And this goes back to Abraham, okay? So the father is responsible for circumcising. What happens if either the father is not around or the father neglects to do that? Who's next in line as responsible? No, interestingly, not in Jewish law. It's the next in line is the Beit Din. The community as a whole is then responsible for circumcising either the infant or the boy or the adult, depending upon when this happens. But then at age 13, the man becomes responsible himself for having himself circumcised. So in later Jewish law, it's the father who has primary responsibility. And then if the father does not or cannot do it, or there is no father that's alive any longer, then it's the community as a whole. And once the child becomes 13, then he has the responsibility for having himself circumcised. And what is that symbolism? What is this? Everybody sort of cringes, right? All right, it's a covenant. What does a covenant mean? It's a relationship. What's the difference between, now are there lawyers in the group? All right, what's the difference between a covenant and a contract? Let's start. The contract is what? First year law. What Yeah, mutual agreement and mutual consideration, right? It's an agreement by two parties, and there is mutual consideration. Usually that means an exchange of money is exchanged for, let's say, some kind of service or some kind of product in some way or another, but it can be mutual exchanges of other sorts. Okay, so mutual agreement and mutual consideration for what? For performance of an act. So it's for a particular task. Now, in contrast to that, what is a covenant? Forget about covenant between God and the people of Israel for the moment. Where else have you heard the word covenant? Covenant of Covenant of marriage, yes. So what's the difference between, so what is the nature of a covenant? It's an agreement to create a relationship, right? And presumably a long-term relationship. The other place where the word covenant used to be used anyway is that there used to be restrictive covenants in America, right? Which would go with the, yes, which would go with the land, right? And so the homeowners, the original homeowners could have these restrictive covenants, barring Jews and blacks and Catholics sometimes from owning property. Those were declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1948. But the point is that these were covenants by virtue of the fact that it was a relationship of all people who owned land in a particular development with each other, and they were intended to last for generations. Well, in the same sort of a way, a marriage is supposed to last for a long time. So are there conditions to the covenant? Yes. But the real issue here is with a covenant is not the particular clauses in the contract. The real issue is the relationship. I mean, I'll give you a personal story about that. It happened that the year before I got married, I was in rabbinical school, and we happened to be studying the section of the Talmud that talks about a husband's obligations to his wife, and vice versa, a wife's obligation to her husband, right? So when I stood under the chuppah, unlike most Jewish grooms, I knew exactly what was required of me by Jewish law, right? We were married in Philadelphia. I had no idea what Pennsylvania law required of me. Turns out not much, by the way. But Jewish, I knew exactly what was required of me. Okay, we went on our honeymoon. We get back, and I found out the first day that we were living in our apartment that I was responsible for something that I had never bargained for, never even imagined. I was taking out the trash. Right. 46 years later, I am still taking out the trash, right? Now, where was that? Well, that's part of the relationship, right? It doesn't have to be written down anywhere. It's part of what people in a relationship do for each other. Now, in the same sort of a way, the circumcision was supposed to be a symbol. It's not the content of the relationship. It's a symbol of the covenant. And why that particular symbol? Well, first of all, it's on the generative part of the man's body. So this is intended to symbolize that this is for generations. It's not just for this particular boy, but it's for this boy and all future generations of the family. Why for the boy and not for the girl? There are African tribes who do clitorotomies, right? Why? Yes, I know, I cringe too. Why not? Well, because it was a patriarchal society. And if you had, one of the good things about it was that it freed women from having to have clitorotomies. Because if you connected the man to the ongoing Jewish people, then you automatically connected all of his family to the ongoing Jewish people, right? And why this kind of symbolism? Well, it's the same kind of thing as to why you would, if you're trying to certify something, right? One way to certify is by signing things, but signing things can, people can fraudulently do that, and whatever they sign can be erased and with water or something maybe. And so if you want something that's really certified, then you have it sealed, right? Transcripts, for example, are sealed, and some documents are sealed. Notice what happens when you seal a document. The level of the paper gets changed, right? So that it's not all on the same level. Well, the same sort of thing is true with circumcision. It was intended to be a permanent sealing of the covenant, permanent both for this boy and for all of his descendants, and it was something that was not retractable. Any of you see the movie Europa, Europa? If you have not seen that movie, you really should see that movie, Netflix or something, right? It's a story about a young man, 15, 16 years of age, happens to live on the border between Germany and Poland just before World War II breaks out, okay? And by mistake, the German, because he speaks German, because he lives on the border, he speaks German fluently as well as Polish and Yiddish. but he speaks German fluently. And so when the Germans take over the town, they think that he's a German. And they put him into a school to train Nazi officers. And what he's worried about, and there's a very funny scene there, by the way, where in biology, where the biology teacher is trying to show that determining who is a proper Aryan is a scientific thing. And he happens to pick this young man as his example, right? And measures his head and measures his nose and that kind of stuff, and declares him to be a proper Aryan. Okay, so much for, what can I say, that kind of science. But anyway, but he's worried that he's going to be discovered as a Jew in the showers. And so he tries to reverse the circumcision. And every man watching that really cringes. But he's not able to do that. But that's the point of the circumcision as the symbolism of this covenant lasting from one generation to another. Now, what happens now, by the way, and Jews have done this for, ever since Abraham, and the reason for it is, again, this religious symbolism. In terms of the medical issues involved, Jews have not done this for medical reasons. It used to be, in the middle of the 20th century, that the vast majority of American boys were circumcised, because the presumption was that this would, why were in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, something like 85% of American young boys were circumcised in the hospital. Why? Yes, specifically what? Yes, because the presumption was, not the presumption, the facts were, as they and still are, that a circumcised man is less likely to get penile cancer and less likely to convey cervical cancer in his sexual partners. That still is the case, but in the late 1990s, the American Academy of Pediatrics said that the chances of either of those happening are basically in balance with whatever the risks are in doing circumcision. And so in the late 1990s, the American Academy of Pediatrics said that if you were doing it for religious reasons, that's one thing, but if you're talking about just doing it for medical reasons, it's a yes, yes, no, no, right? Now, just about 2 months ago, the American Academy of Pediatrics reversed its position and actually is recommending circumcision. Why? AIDS, exactly right. Because there now is a mountain of, I do a lot of bioethics, there now is a mountain of evidence, both here and in Africa where the AIDS crisis really began, that men who are circumcised are much less likely to get AIDS themselves from their sexual partners or to transfer AIDS to their sexual partners, and not just AIDS, also other sexually transmitted diseases. And so now the American Academy of Pediatrics again recommends that boys be circumcised for medical reasons. Again, Jews never did it for medical reasons. They did it for these religious reasons, the symbolism of which I was just describing to you. But it's sort of interesting to see how the medical profession has sort of changed over this issue. Take a look, if you will. The next thing that I have in your packet is a selection from the Midrash on Zipporah. So, and the Midrash really concentrates on the two stories we've seen so far, namely Zipporah and Moses at the well, and then Zipporah in this issue of circumcision. Take a moment, take some time, actually, it'll take you a little while, to read the section Moses marries Zipporah. It's on pages 4 and 5 of the handout. Okay? Now, what is the issue here? Why are Moses and Aaron speaking rumors and saying nasty things about Zipporah? Okay? There's an entire story about this in the Midrash, which I didn't give you in in your handout because it was big enough already. But let me just read it to you. When the 70 elders were appointed, right, by Moses. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon them. All the women lighted the candles of joy to celebrate by this illumination the elevation of these men to the dignity of prophets. Zipporah, Moses' wife, saw the illumination and asked Miriam to explain it. She told her the reason and added, "Blessed are the women who will behold with their eyes how their husbands are raised to dignity." Zipporah answered, "It would be more proper to say, 'Woe to the wives of these men who must now abstain from all conjugal happiness.'" So the way that the rabbis understand it is Zipporah was not at all happy to be the wife of the leader, Moses. Why was she not happy? Because he was never home. Okay? He was never home for anything, including sex. Miriam says, "How do you know this?" Zipporah says, "I judge so from the conduct of your brother," namely Moses, right? "For ever since he was chosen to receive divine revelations, he no longer knows his wife." Knows in the biblical sense of know, right? And the story goes on. And why was, and the way that the Midrash continues on, Moses abstains from conjugal joys only out of pride, she is saying, right? To show how holy a man he is. Not only did they speak, remember what happens with Moses and Aaron, with Aaron and Miriam, as a result of saying this gossip about Moses and about his wife. What happens to them? They become they get leprosy, right? So the question is, what was it why was their gossip so bad? And the way that the Midrash has it is because they were saying that he was staying away from home only because he was such an avid and devoted leader. But the way the Midrash has it is the following. But he, who could be self-assured and stern when it touched a matter concerning God's glory, Moses, was silent to the undeserved reproaches they heaped upon him, knowing that upon God's bidding he had forsworn earthly pleasures. Oh my is right. This sounds downright what? Christian, yes. Specifically Catholic, okay? Because what it sounds like is that the Midrash is saying that the leader ought to be celibate. And that God it gets worse than this, right? I'll read you the line that comes a little bit later. This is God talking to him, that is to Moses. "I have revealed all that is in the water and all that is upon the dry land. To him did I confide the sanctuary and set him above the angels. I myself," capital M there, God talking, "ordered him to abstain from conjugal life." Like a pope, yes. Now, this is really problematic, right? I remember I told you at the beginning, I want to make sure that you understand that there was honesty in advertising here, that we were going to talk about intermarriage, circumcision, and sex. Here's the sex. Or lack thereof, right? Okay. The rabbis, really, the reason why this is so surprising coming out of a rabbinic text is because the rabbis really went in the exact opposite direction when it came time to talking about Jewish law. The Torah says, this is Exodus, there are two positive commandments in the Torah in regard to sex. The first is in the very first chapter of Genesis that we're reading this week. God created the human being, male and female, God created them, and told them, pru urvu, be fruitful and multiply. Okay? So procreation is one of the purposes of sex in the Jewish tradition, and it's a commandment. Okay? It's not advice, it's a commandment. But the other time is Exodus chapter 21, which you're all going to run home and read now. But Exodus 21, which says that when a man takes a woman as his wife, she'erak ksuta v'onata lo yigra, her food, her clothing, and her rights to sex, he may not diminish. That's at least the way the rabbis read onata. There are some biblical scholars who think that it might mean her ointments. Her food, her clothing, and her ointments, he may not diminish. But the way the rabbis understood onatah is her food, her clothing, and her rights to sex. Now that line, as the rabbis understand it, is amazing, because in every other culture that I know, both East that is in Asia and West, the presumption is that men have sexual appetites, women do not. Women acquiesce to the. So you're Jewish. Anyway, the presumption of every other culture is that women acquiesce to the sexual advances of their husbands because they want two things. What do they want? Children and support. See how easy that was? Okay. So the presumption of every other culture that I know of is exactly that. And as a result, women accept the sexual advances of their husbands, but they do so sometimes, the presumption is, just because they have to in order to be able to have children and have economic support.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Understand that for Jewish divorce, one of the things are.
Yes, I'm getting there. Now, the rabbis, however, using this line in the Torah, say, no, as a matter of fact, both men and women have sexual desires, and they both have a right to have them satisfied within marriage. So the rabbis in the Mishnah actually talk about how often does a man have to offer to have sex with his wife. And it depends upon his job. So if they're not allowed to have sex during her menstrual period, by the way, and then for a few days thereafter. But then, if he's home every night, then every night. If he's a donkey driver and home every other night, then every other night. If he's a camel driver and home every third night, then every third night. And if he's a scholar, once a week on Shabbat. If he's a sailor, then once every 6 months. And if she married him and knew that he was a sailor, then she knew that that's what their sex life was going to be like. But if she married him and he was doing something else for a living, then he could not become a sailor unless he got her permission, because he would thereby be diminishing her rights to sex within marriage. Now, conversely, that's what the law says. That's what the Mishnah says, all right? Conversely, a man has a right to sex within marriage as well. But here again, Jewish law was way ahead of every other culture I know of. It recognized that there could be rape within a marriage. Right? Rape within a marriage. And it prohibited it. This goes back to the Talmud. I can tell you, that's Eruvin 100b, if you want to know the source. Right? The Talmud prohibits marital rape. American law did not prohibit no state in America prohibited, even had the category of marital rape until 1975, right? Why? Because the common law presumes that when you get a license to marry, what that means is that the man has a license to have sex with his wife whenever he wants it. And that therefore, rape by definition could not take place within a marriage. That's the common law, right? That all of the states have inherited. The first state, you'll never guess this, the first state to have a law that prohibits marital rape is, what would you guess?
California.
Not California.
Nevada.
Not Nevada. What?
Texas.
Not Utah.
Texas.
South Dakota. Don't ask me. 1975, South Dakota was the first state to have a law against marital rape. It wasn't until 1993 that all 50 states had a law against marital rape, but in 30 of the 50 states, the burden of proof is still on the woman to show that it wasn't consensual. So the old, common law presumptions are alive and well still. But in Jewish law, the presumption was that a man could not force himself upon his wife. So what happens if she refuses to have sex with him day after day after day after day? If he can't force himself, right, on her? Well, then it's a debate between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. What else is new? Beit Shammai says that this can go on for a week. Beit Hillel says for 2 weeks. And then what? Well, then he can begin to diminish the amount of money that he would have to pay her in a divorce settlement, a certain amount per week, until ultimately he doesn't have to pay her anything, and he can divorce her and marry someone else, because he has rights to sex within marriage just as she does. Okay? Now, this is all based on Exodus chapter 21. And given this, it is and what you were saying a moment ago is right, because this is a right of the woman within marriage, then if the man is not fulfilling this, and the woman comes to court, right, by the way, you understand that in most marriages, this is something that is worked out by the couple, okay? And it usually doesn't get to court, thank God, okay? And that exactly how often they're going to have sex will diminish over time because the hormones diminish over time, and it's a function of how often they want to in the first place. So in the vast majority of marriages, this never gets to court. But if it does get to court, then what the rabbinic court will say, either have sex with her or divorce her so she can marry someone else, because she has rights to sex within marriage. Okay? Now, given that background, this Midrash is astounding, right? That the notion that Zipporah was married to Moses, and that Moses was told by God that he didn't need to have sex with her, right? The rabbis are saying, the Torah doesn't say this, by the way, right? This is a Midrash. And I hasten to tell you, this is a Midrash. It's not the only Midrash on the story, okay? But the fact that there could be even a Midrash on the notion that Zipporah was married to a man who never had sex with her, and therefore said, these poor wives of these 70 elders that have just been appointed, they've just lost their sex lives. The fact that the Midrash could say that is, really goes against the grain of a lot of the rest of the Jewish tradition. I want to mention one last thing to you, and then it's a little after 9, so we'll stop. The last thing that I want to mention to you in regard to this is that the character of Zipporah, why is she called Zipporah? The word Zipporah comes from the root, what is it, Zippor in Hebrew? A bird. So the question is that the rabbis ask is, why is she called that? And the answer that they give is that, like a bird, she was lickety-split in circumcising, we don't know whom, but Gershom or Eliezer, right? Lickety-split, she did that just as a bird would do, and thereby saved the day. Okay? So if we're talking about Zipporah, we're talking about a woman who, at least both in the Torah's stories and in the Midrash on her, is a much more fleshed out character than what you would normally expect. You hear very little about Zipporah in the Torah, but what we have learned tonight is that she is a woman who maybe converted to Judaism, in any case agreed to raise her children as Jews. We're talking about a woman who circumcised the son even when Moses had failed to do that, maybe because of this deal that he had with Yitro, and so therefore was in fact interested in raising her children as Jews, whether she herself was Jewish or not. And by the way, in our own time, there are a lot of interfaith couples. About a third of interfaith couples raise their children as Jews. About a third raise their children as Christians, and about a third with no religion whatsoever, or both, but that usually means no religion whatsoever. And that's why intermarriage is a problem for us in terms of the ongoing continuity of the Jewish people. But there are non-Jews who are married to Jews, who are willing to raise their children as Jews, and Zipporah might well have been such a model. And she is somebody who, at least according to the Midrash, insists on her sex rights. Yes?
Well, because I think you said in one part Zipporah is a Midianite, and then later it says she's a Cushite.
Yeah.
Yes.
So was Midianite and Cushite interchangeable, or were they?
It's possible. That's why if you look on page 8, the note at the bottom of page 8, right, it's possible that she's from Nubia or Ethiopia, that is Africa, because Cush is the name for Ethiopia in the Bible. But on the other hand, at least in this one source in another book of the Bible called Habakkuk 3:7, Cush might refer to Cushan, a Midianite tribe, in which case she's not from Africa, she's from Midian. Where was Midian of antiquity? Modern day what? No, Midian was, yes, the southern part of Jordan was where the Midianites lived. Okay? So it's possible that she was from there. That Cush was simply a district in Midian. Okay? All right, yes, one last one. Go ahead.
Yeah. And you also talked about, in some of the footnotes, it talked about that blood was a protective sign against the plague and against evil.
Right, yes.
So perhaps Zipporah thought, if I draw blood, this will protect my child.
Yes, absolutely. Blood was, well, what is blood already in the story of Noah? Blood is you're allowed, remember, Adam and Eve were only allowed to eat, were required to be vegetarians. Noah is allowed to eat meat, but what is he required to do? Take the blood out of the meat. Why? Because the blood is the sign of life. So in the ancient world, that was very commonly the case. And so blood would be understood as a cleansing agent. Blood is understood as a healing agent because it's the sign of life. It's the opposite of sickness and death. So yes, absolutely. The fact that she sprinkles blood on between his legs, we don't know whose legs, right, could well be an attempt to try to protect him from illness or attack. Okay, thank you. You're welcome.